Good morning and welcome to Reflections from Yates Chapel. My name is Beth Miller and I'm the director of the Mississippi Course of Study School and Licensing School housed in the Center for Ministry here at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi. This morning, as I offer thoughts and reflections to you in an overarching kind of way, I'd like for us to think about how we glorify God in our lives. And my thoughts are often drawn to hymnody of the church, and a contemporary hymn that draws me is Be Glorified. In my life, Lord, be glorified. So this morning, my reflections come specifically from the Gospel of Luke in the 18th chapter. The verses are 9 through 14, and it is one of Jesus' stories. It is the parable of the Pharisees and the Pharisee and the tax collector. And I'll be focusing specifically on two verses 9 and then verse 14, and I'll share that in just a moment. But first, I'd like to share with you an experience that I had in September, mid to late September 1999. And as I reflect on it this morning, it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I was attending License to Preach school that was being held at Main Street United Methodist Church in Hattiesburg. We had taken our lunch break, and I was en route back to Main Street, traveling west on Hardy Street. And as I arrived at the traffic light at University of Southern Mississippi, the light caught me on red. And as I sat there waiting for the traffic light to change, I noticed this cortege, if you will, of sleek, black, shiny limousines coming out of the entrance to the college. And as I sat there then, the light remained on red, but even so, there was law enforcement persons directing traffic. And as I saw all this fleet of cars leave the campus, I remembered that a celebration of life service was being held on campus that day, honoring and celebrating the life of Miss Osceola McCarty. Miss McCarty was a woman that was described as a washerwoman who, over the course of her life from age about 10, from about the 6th grade forward, she no longer attended school to be at home helping to care for her aged and infirmed aunt. And she took in washing. She took in clothes from the community to make them clean, fresh, ironed, starched, and returned to the owners of the clothing. And over all those years, when she did such what we might think menial work, she saved her dollars, her pennies, and her quarters and saved them in her doll buggy. And over the years of her saving, she accumulated in excess of $200,000 from doing clothes. That experience has remained seminal in my life because of the influence of her humility. The influence of her humility and how in her humility she glorified God. So the verse 9 from this parable, from the New Revised Standard Version, reads this: that Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. And then from the Message, it reads, verse 9 does, to some who were complacently pleased with themselves. In other words, there was this dialogue, there was this observation of two persons, the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the way they presented themselves to God in prayer in the temple, such that one said, "Oh, I'm so glad that I am not like this person," but one then who was despised by the community at large because of the role and scope of his work, yielded himself in humility, beat upon his chest in humility, and in essence, glorified God. You see, I think for us as individuals, indeed for us as the context at large, when we begin to do the work of, which is some of the hardest work that we ever do in our lives, which is self-examination, and we call upon ourselves then to peel away, if you will, to strip away, if you will, all our self-protections, all the things that that we say, "Oh, I'm not really like that," or "I'm not really like that." But then when we come to the place of malleable clay, of offering forth self, then we become our truest self of who we are, so that we indeed have something wonderful to offer. Laura S. Sugg says this, that parables are like fishing lures. They are full of attractive feathers and bright colors, and they end with a sharp little barb. That sharp little barb was what caught the tax collector. And there was no barb that had to be experienced by the lady who did close. Rather, she had long since already torn all those barbs away. She had encountered the fullness of her interior self to make herself humble, to make herself an influence, though that was never her primary objective. Her primary objective was work. Her primary objective was self-sustaining. Her primary objective was contributing to her family. But oh my goodness, the larger experience of what she gave in her humility was a wonderful gift that eventually became scholarship. But overarchingly, it was her humility that impacts this soul even to this day. The other verse that I'd like you to listen to my own considerations is this, the 14th verse. And from the New Revised Standard Translation, it reads this: "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted." From the Message, it reads this way: "If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself, you will become more than yourself." This morning, my prayer is for myself, for the world at large, for the local communities in which we live, that we might, and I begin with myself, in my own interior self-examination, that I strip away all my false pretenses, such that I become an attractive witness, if you will, but one whose barb has been dulled, and simply the invitation and the joy is what remains. I go back to the initial words of hymnody with which I began. "In my life, Lord, be glorified. And then in my heart, Lord, be glorified. The hymn reads, in our church, Lord, in your church, Lord, be glorified. And I would also add, in our humanity, in the humanity of the world, O Lord, be glorified. In the way in which we attend to your creation, be glorified. The parable that Jesus taught, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, indeed had a sharp barb in it. But the barb is always to draw us in, always to invite us to self-reflection, so that in the reflection, in this particular instance, we find a deepening humility so that we may live with an overarchingly glorifying to God influence. It's a charge to which I shall hold myself accountable, and I invite all who hear my words to consider the same. In my life, Lord, be glorified. Amen.